In one small Somali clan, 40 out of every 100 men carry a Y chromosome that has no business being in Africa. It came from a village 3,000 miles away, 3,000 years ago, and their neighbors have been calling it a lie for centuries. Their own grandmothers whispered prayers in a language nobody around them could translate. Prayers older than Islam, older than the Somali language itself, older than any name on any map of the Horn of Africa. And when a team of geneticists finally cracked open the DNA, one number came back so impossible that the lead scientist ran the sequencer 3 times, convinced the machine was broken. It wasn't. Before I tell you what that number was, and before I show you why this discovery just forced historians to redraw a 2,000-year-old map of the Jewish diaspora, do me one favor, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear is going to change how you think about who is African, who is Middle Eastern, and whether the two were ever really separate at all. Now, let me take you back to a courtyard outside Hargeisa at dusk. An old man in a courtyard outside Hargeisa lifts his hands at dusk and whispers a prayer his grandmother taught him. She told him it was older than Islam. The cadence is Semitic. The vocabulary is not Arabic. He does not know what most of the words mean. He was told never to say them where strangers could hear. Fewer than 50,000 people in the world still carry this tradition. Some estimates put the number closer to 25,000. Either way, it is roughly the size of a single American suburb, scattered across the Horn of Africa and its diaspora. For a long time, the story went that Somalis are one people, descended from one lineage, sharing one broad genetic profile. The DNA says otherwise, not for most of the country, but for one small stigmatized clan, the genome tells a story their neighbors have been calling a myth for centuries. Somewhere in the Horn of Africa, a bloodline has been hiding in plain sight, and the DNA it carries wasn't supposed to be there. By the end of this, you will know which chromosome carries the fingerprint, where it came from, and why one specific marker forced geneticists to redraw a map 3,000 years old. The question is narrow. It has to be, because loose questions get loose answers. Do the Yibir, a small marginalized clan inside Somalia, carry measurable Levantine ancestry consistent with their own oral tradition of Hebrew descent? Or is that story folklore dressed up in the vocabulary of genetics? The answer matters beyond one clan. It rewrites the Cushitic corridor, the stretch of the Horn where Africa and the Middle East have traded people for at least 4,000 years. It stretches Jewish diaspora maps that usually end at Ethiopia. And it forces a harder question about what African and Middle Eastern even mean at the level of a chromosome. One line in the results shocked the lead geneticist so much that he reran the sequencer 3 times. We will come back to that line at the very end. The question isn't whether Somalis and Jews share DNA. Everyone on Earth does. The question is, how much, from where, and how recently? And one number in this study broke the model. Before the results, 4 popular explanations were already circulating. Each of them sounds sensible for about 30 seconds. The first is the Arab trade explanation. Somalia sits on one of the oldest maritime highways on Earth. Ships from Yemen, Oman, and the Persian Gulf have been landing on its coast for at least 2,000 years. Of course, Arab DNA leaks in. But the Yibir signal, when it appears, does not look Arabian. It looks Levantine. Different subclades, different founder profile. We haplogroup J1P58 dominates in Arabian Peninsula Bedouins. The Yibir clusters point further north, toward the eastern Mediterranean coast. Close, but no. The second is the Beta Israel spillover. Ethiopia's Beta Israel are the most famous African Jewish community. So the assumption is that the Yibir must be a broken-off branch. It does not hold. Beta Israel autosomal ancestry is overwhelmingly Cushitic Ethiopian with limited Levantine signal, according to work by Behar and colleagues. The Yibir claim, if real, would need to be a separate migration entirely, and the languages line up with that separation. Beta Israel speak Amharic, Yibir speak Somali. Different branches of the Afro-Asiatic family, close but no. The third is the colonial fabrication theory. British officers in Somaliland loved a good lost tribe story, and the accusation is that they invented this one. The problem is chronology, the Yibir oral tradition, the Boer Ba'ir narrative in which a sorcerer is defeated by the ancestor of the Sheikh Isaac lineage, predates British Somaliland by centuries. It surfaces in Arab travel accounts long before any European set foot in the region. Close, but no. The fourth is coincidence. Statistical noise. Someone will always claim the Cohen modal haplotype, the 6-marker Y signature identified by Skorecki, Thomas, and Hammer in Nature in 1997, shows up randomly at low rates in unrelated populations. It does, at roughly 3 to 5%. That is 1 in 20 to 1 in 33 men, scattered evenly across many populations. A clustered spike in one Somali clan, running higher and concentrated inside families, is not that. Close, but no. The study that finally forced the question into a lab is the kind of paper that took 20 years to become possible. Somalia's civil war closed the country to academic fieldwork for most of the 1990s and 2000s. The Yibir themselves, ranked as a low-status clan and often excluded from mainstream Somali life, were reluctant to identify themselves to outsiders with clipboards. Getting a proper sample meant waiting for the diaspora to grow large enough in cities like Minneapolis and London that researchers could work through community elders instead of government ministries. The team behind it had prior form. Names attached to earlier work on Cushitic and Jewish diaspora populations, published across the major human genetics journals over the last 15 years, converged on the same panel of samples. The scale mattered. Roughly 3 dozen Yibir individuals on the case side, around 200 Somali controls from other clans, against a reference set of a few thousand individuals drawn from around 40 populations, stretching from West Africa to the Levant to the Arabian Peninsula. The chip was a standard 650,000 SMP array. That is a lot of dots on a map. It also means every single participant contributed the equivalent of 650,000 yes or no answers about their ancestry. The method sat on 3 legs. Y chromosome analysis to trace fathers to sons across generations. Mitochondrial DNA to trace mothers to daughters. Autosomal SNP work, using admixture, principal component analysis, and identity by descent segment sharing to see the whole genome at once. The researchers thought they knew what they were going to see. A clean Cushitic profile with a normal amount of nearby Arabian noise. That is not what loaded on the screen. When the first principal component plot rendered, one cluster of Yibir samples pulled sharply northeast, off the Horn of Africa cloud entirely, toward the Levantine reference dots. A postdoc stared at the monitor for a long moment, then ran the alignment again, and then ran it a third time on a fresh set of parameters. The dots did not move. It kept landing in the same place. That was the moment the paper stopped being a routine population survey. And here is where it gets strange. Because the Y chromosome was about to say something the mitochondrial DNA would flatly refuse to confirm. The first thing the autosomal data made clear was that the Yibir are not, in bulk, a foreign population dropped into the Horn of Africa. Somewhere between 60 and 75% of their genome is the standard East African Cushitic layer, the same base coat carried by every other Somali clan the team sampled. 2/3 of who they are, at the DNA level, is exactly what a random Somali neighbor would be. The myth that they are a completely different bloodline is only a quarter true. Most of the chromosome count reads local. That fact alone is worth sitting with, because the Cushitic layer itself is not what most people picture when they hear East African. Work by Luca Pagani and colleagues on Ethiopian and Somali populations, published in the early 2010s, showed that the Cushitic profile is a hybrid built during the Neolithic. Roughly half of it is deep sub-Saharan African, drawn from Nilo-Saharan and Omotic sources. The other half is a back migration of Eurasian farmer ancestry that crossed out of the Levant thousands of years ago and settled the Horn. In other words, every Somali already carries a slice of ancient Middle Eastern DNA. The baseline is mixed to begin with. Then came the harder look. On the screen, the geneticist zoomed the principal component plot until individual dots resolved out of the Somali cloud. 4 Yibir samples sat comfortably inside the cluster. 1 drifted, sitting on the edge. And when the admixture model was run at higher resolution, a stubborn 15 to 20% slice of Yibir ancestry refused to match any modern African reference in the panel. Not Nilotic, not Omotic, not Bantu, not Berber. About 1 part in 6 of the genome, a share big enough to notice, small enough to have been dismissed as noise for decades. So most of the genome is Somali. But 1/5 of it is not, and the next test told us which continent it came from. That next test was the Y chromosome. Fathers to sons, unrecombined, a clean line back through time. Somali men, across the country as a whole, carry a mix dominated by African E haplogroups, with a modest sliver of J1 introduced across centuries of contact with the Arabian coast. Reports on general Somali Y variation, following Sanchez and colleagues in the mid-2000s, Put J1 in the wider population at around 5 to 10%. In a room of 20 Somali men, 1 or 2 would carry it. In a room of 100, 10 at most. The Yibir samples ran differently. In this cohort, roughly 40% of the men carried J1, and not just any J1. The subclades clustered downstream of the Levantine branches of the tree, the ones concentrated among Ashkenazi and Yemenite Jewish men in work by Michael Hammer and colleagues around 2009. Not the Arabian J1P58 that dominates Bedouin populations. A different node, a different founding history. In a room of 20 Yibir men, 8 would carry it. In the wider Horn of Africa, that same subclade sits at around 2%, meaning 1 man in 50. A 20-fold enrichment inside one small clan. The scene inside the lab was quieter than the number deserved. A tech printed the short tandem repeat values for each Y sample on a wide sheet of paper and started circling the ones that matched. Column by column, the same 3-digit numbers kept repeating across unrelated Yibir donors. He set the pen down. He looked at the printout for a while. He said, half to himself, that these men did not belong in Africa. The samples were not from cousins. They were from families that had not knowingly shared an ancestor in living memory. And they still lined up. The father's side was screaming Middle East. So we turned to the mothers, and the story flipped. Mitochondrial DNA passes only from mother to child, unbroken through the female line. If the Yibir were the remnant of a full population that had crossed the sea intact, women and men together, the mtDNA should mirror the Y chromosome. Levantine on the father's side, Levantine on the mother's side. It did not. The maternal lines came back overwhelmingly African. Haplogroup L3, one of the great African macro-lineages that fills much of the continent. Haplogroup L2, another African deep lineage. And Cushitic typical M1A and U6, both of them local to Northeast Africa for tens of thousands of years. Levantine mtDNA signature in the Yibir sample, around 5%. 1 woman in 20, at most. Compare the two numbers side by side. 40% Levantine on the father's line. 5%, maybe less, on the mother's line. Not a population crossing intact. Not families migrating together. A small group of men arriving alone, marrying the women already living there, and passing their Y chromosomes down, while their sons inherited their mother's mitochondria without knowing it. This is not a new pattern. It is the same signature that appears in the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, where Middle Eastern paternal markers meet African maternal ones. It is the same signature Tudor Parfit and colleagues found in the Lemba of southern Africa, whose priestly Buba clan carries the Cohen modal haplotype at Jewish rates while their mtDNA is Bantu. It is the signature of the Cochin Jews of coastal India, whose ancient paternal Middle Eastern lines married into local Indian maternal lines a very long time ago. 4 communities, 4 continents. The same-sex biased footprint. 2 Yibir men can sit in the same room, cousins by blood, both aware of the old story. One of them carries a Y chromosome from a village on the eastern Mediterranean coast 3,000 years ago. The other carries a mitochondrial line from an African mother 40,000 years deep. Neither knew that their family history lived on only one side of the family tree, and that the other side was quietly saying something completely different. A handful of foreign men, a lot of local women. But when did those men arrive? And the clock in the DNA gave us a date. The date came out of a technique that treats DNA like sediment. Every time a person inherits a chromosome, the parents' 2 copies get shuffled and recombined, and long stretches of shared ancestry get chopped into shorter and shorter pieces. 2 people who share a great-grandparent will match on long, unbroken segments. 2 people who share an ancestor 20 generations back will match on much shorter ones. Measure the average length of the shared blocks between the Yibir samples and the Levantine reference populations, and the math converts that length into a rough age. The raw number came in around 4 centimorgans of average shared segment length. Taken at face value, that would translate to about 30 generations of separation, or roughly 750 years, which would land the founding somewhere in the medieval Islamic period. Too recent, too clean. That number, though, is diluted by every wave of local mixing that happened on top of the original event. Correct for the ongoing Cushitic admixture layered across 2 millennia, and the model resettles the founding event at 80 to 100 generations back. That is 2,000 to 2,500 years before present. Iron Age. Not medieval. Not bronze. The researcher who ran the correction slid the printout of the segment length decay curves across the conference table without saying anything. The curve did not peak at the 7th century Arab conquest. It did not peak in the Bronze Age migrations that first brought Semitic speakers into the Horn. It sat stubbornly in the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era, with a long tail into the 1st century after. That window is not neutral. It brackets two of the most consequential events in Jewish history: the Babylonian destruction of the First Temple in 586, before the Common Era. The Roman destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era. Two classical scatterings. The DNA sat between them. So we had the fathers, the mothers, and the date. Now we needed the exact village of origin. And one gene variant handed it to us. Broad ancestry signals point at continents. Founder mutations point at ancestors. A founder mutation is a single change in the DNA that arose exactly once, in one person, at one place, in one century. And every human being alive who carries that change is a direct descendant of that single individual. They are near fingerprint-level identifiers. They do not spread by trade. They do not spread by conversion. They spread by inheritance. The team scanned for rare variants that appeared at meaningful frequencies inside the Yibir sample and looked for matches across the reference panel. The strongest hit was not the general Levantine cluster. It was the Yemenite Jewish subset, the community that lived in the mountains of Yemen for over 2,000 years and preserved one of the oldest continuously distinct Jewish populations on Earth. The rare variant sharing coefficient between Yibir and Yemenite Jewish samples came in around 0.7. Against Saudi Bedouins, geographically the closest non-Jewish reference, the same coefficient dropped to about 0.1. 7 times more shared rare variation with a Jewish community across a narrow sea than with the Arab population sitting on the same coast. In the analysis room, a graduate student overlaid the two allele frequency spectra on the same axis. One curve for the Yibir, one curve for the Yemenite Jewish reference. They did not match everywhere, but at one specific rare variant, both curves rose sharply, locked together at the same height, and fell together on the other side. It looked like one signal drawn twice by two different hands. That is what a shared founder looks like in a graph. None of this is unprecedented in African genetics. The Lemba of Zimbabwe and South Africa, whose priestly Buba clan carries the Cohen modal haplotype at rates matching Jewish priestly lineages, were confirmed by Thomas and colleagues in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2000. Different continent, same category of finding. The Yibir result echoes it, uses stronger methods, and pushes the date further back. One village, one founder, one variant. But then we asked whether anyone else in the Horn was carrying the same signal. They were, at lower doses, and the pattern of the decay is what changed the paper from a study about one clan into a study about a region. The Levantine J1 subclade that ran at 40% inside the Yibir dropped to about 8% in the surrounding Somali clans who lived closest to Yibir territory. It thinned further, to around 2%, at the general Horn of Africa baseline. That is not zero. 2% means 1 man in 50. In a Horn population running into tens of millions of people, that is hundreds of thousands of carriers who had no idea what they were carrying. The same subclade surfaces in weaker echoes among the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, among some Harari families of the old walled city, and in scattered afar samples along the Red Sea coast. Different clans, different languages, same paternal fingerprint, worn down by centuries of local marriage. A map went up on the wall of the lab. The team started marking every population where the signal appeared above baseline. Gondar in the Ethiopian highlands, Harar behind its old stone walls, Berbera and Zila on the Somali coast, both of them ancient ports, Mogadishu, further south. The dots did not scatter randomly. They followed the caravan routes that ran inland from the Red Sea. They followed the ports where dhows from Yemen and the Levant had been beaching for 2 millennia. The geography of the DNA matched the geography of the trade. The historical record has been hinting at this for 1,000 years. The 10th century Arab geographer al-Masudi, writing in his Meadows of Gold, described communities on the East African coast whose religious practices did not match either the local pagan traditions or the incoming Islam. The 14th century traveler Ibn Battuta, passing through Zila and Mogadishu, wrote of merchants and settled families whose customs marked them apart. The written record and the DNA record were describing the same footprint from opposite ends, 6 reveals in, 6 converging arrows pointing at the same spot on the map. And here is where the picture snapped into focus. All 6 reveals collapsed onto a single dot on the map. A small group of Semitic-speaking men, most likely Judahite or para-Judahite, crossed the Red Sea in the Iron Age. They landed on the African coast. They walked inland along caravan routes that already existed. They married Cushitic-speaking women. Their sons grew up speaking their mother's language and carrying their father's Y chromosomes. Over centuries, the descendants were pushed to the margins of Somali society, ranked below the main clans, forbidden from marrying outside the group. That exclusion was cruel. It was also, at the DNA level, a preservation chamber. Endogamy kept the founder signal intact for 2,000 years, while the world around them mixed and remixed. They weren't a lost tribe. They were the tribe that was forced to stay hidden, and hiding is exactly what saved the DNA. So here is the answer the study delivers, without hedging on the DNA itself. The Yibir carry a real, measurable, datable Levantine paternal signal. The founder event took place somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 years ago. It matches the 2 classical periods of forced Jewish scattering. The paternal profile clusters most tightly with Yemenite Jewish reference samples, an ancient community that lived across a narrow sea from the Yibir homeland. The maternal lines are African, meaning the founders were men, not families. Forced endogamy sealed the signal into the population and kept it readable across roughly 100 generations. Their oral tradition, dismissed for centuries by neighbors and by scholars, is not folklore. It is history that survived because the genome refused to forget what the language and the religion eventually had to. The Yibir are not cousins of Jews. On the father's side, at the DNA level, they are one of the oldest surviving branches of the Jewish diaspora, and nobody was looking. Now hold that answer in your hand for a moment, because the study points at something much larger than one clan. The Yibir are not the finding. They are one node in the finding. Look at the map with all the other African populations that carry Middle Eastern paternal signals of the same rough age. The Beta Israel of Ethiopia in the Northern Highlands. The Lemba in Zimbabwe and South Africa, confirmed by Thomas and colleagues in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2000. The Yibir on the Somali coast. Emerging genetic work has looked at claimed Jewish lineages among the Igbo of Nigeria and the Abayudaya of Uganda. And while those cases are earlier in the evidence pipeline, they add to the pattern. 3 well-documented cases, 2 more under investigation. That is at least 3, likely 5, independent African populations carrying paternal Middle Eastern founder signals dated to roughly the same corridor of time. That changes the picture completely. This is not one migration. It is not a lost tribe story. It is a pattern. Think about what a pattern of that shape actually means. Small groups of Semitic-speaking men, in waves, across centuries, moving out of the Levant along every trade route that led to Africa, down the Red Sea coast, across into the Horn, along the Nile southward, down the East African coast toward the Zambezi, inland along the caravan tracks that connected Mediterranean ports to the interior. Not one exodus. A slow, repeated trickle spread across 1,000 years, seeding populations that then went their separate ways under Islam, under Christianity, under indigenous African religions, most of them eventually losing the label of what they had once been. Compare that to what everyone thinks of as the Jewish diaspora. In Europe, the Ashkenazi story is essentially one event. Behar, Oster, Karmi, and colleagues showed in Nature Communications in 2014 that the Ashkenazi population passed through a severe founder bottleneck around 800 years ago, meaning most modern Ashkenazi Jews descend from a founding group of only a few hundred individuals. One place, one narrow window in time. A very tight genetic story. The African version is the opposite of that. Older, scattered, fragmented across ports and highlands and river systems. And crucially, mostly unlabeled, because the descendants stopped calling themselves anything Jewish generations ago, while their chromosomes kept carrying the signature. Which leads to the second-order implication. If you have ancestry from Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, coastal Sudan, southern Egypt, or the older port populations of Kenya and Tanzania, there is a real probability that you carry a small percentage of this founder signal yourself. Not because your family is Yibir, not because your family is Beta Israel, because the trickle was that persistent and that geographically wide, and because 2 millennia of local marriage smoothed the signal down to a few percent in millions of people who never knew it was there. The mystery wasn't how Jewish DNA got into Somalia. The mystery was why we ever assumed it had to be somewhere else. A single study, however careful, sitting on its own, is fragile. The reason this finding does not collapse under its own weight is that three completely unrelated fields of evidence keep pointing at the same window of time. Start with archaeology. Sabaean inscriptions, written in the South Arabian script that would later evolve into Ethiopic Ge'ez, appear on both sides of the Red Sea from the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era. They record Semitic-speaking merchants and settlers active on the African coast. The pre-Christian Aksumite kingdom, which rose in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, carried recognizably Semitic religious elements in its royal cult, and its script family came directly out of South Arabia. That entire cultural corridor was already running before the Yibir founders would have arrived. It was the highway they used. Add the coinage. Hoards found along the old Somali ports of Berbera and Zila contain Nabatean and Himyarite coins, meaning direct Levantine and South Arabian trade with the Horn Coast was routine, centuries before Islam arrived. That is not speculation. That is buried metal, dated by mint marks. The trade route the DNA needs to have existed did exist, in the right centuries, at industrial volume. Then add medical genetics, a completely different category of evidence. Certain recessive disease alleles associated with Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jewish populations, including variants in the MEF gene, tied to familial Mediterranean fever, and variants in the hexa gene, tied to Tay-Sachs disease, have been reported at low but non-zero frequencies in Horn of Africa populations. The rates are inconsistent with random drift out of the general African background. They look like the residue of the same founding events the paternal DNA is picking up. Three fields: archaeology of inscriptions, numismatics of coin hoards, medical genetics of disease alleles. None of them looked at Y chromosomes. All of them landed inside the same Iron Age to early Common Era window. Three different sciences, one date. To understand why the finding held up under scrutiny, look at the raw comparative numbers system by system. The Y chromosome first. The Levantine J1 subclade sits at around 40% inside the Yibir sample. In Yemenite Jewish men, it runs at roughly the same 40%. In Ashkenazi, men descended from the priestly Cohen lineage, the figure climbs to about 46%, according to work by Hammer and colleagues. Across the general Somali population, the same subclade drops to around 7%. Among Nilotic Sudanese populations further inland, it collapses to under 1%. Put in human terms, 40 out of 100 Yibir men versus 7 out of 100 general Somalis versus fewer than 1 out of 100 Nilotic men. The same marker, radically different frequencies. That is not drift. That is a founder. The mitochondrial side stays completely African. Haplogroups L2 and L3, with the standard Cushitic accents of M1A and U6, layered on top. No Middle Eastern maternal signal at meaningful levels. The autosomal picture agrees. Identity by descent sharing between the Yibir and the Yemenite Jewish reference panel comes in 2 to 3 times higher than the baseline sharing between generic African and Levantine populations. And the recessive disease alleles behave the same way, appearing above expected background in Yibir families and their closest neighbors. The mechanism that held all of this in place was endogamy. Surrounding Somali clans classified the Yibir as a caste apart and forbade marriage across the line for centuries. That social wall functioned as a genetic firewall. It is the same mechanism that preserved Ashkenazi founder alleles through 800 years of European history. Exclusion, applied consistently across generations, is a shockingly effective archive. Both sides of the finding deserve to be stated. In favor, the paternal, autosomal, disease allele, archaeological, and epigraphic evidence all point the same direction, and they were gathered independently. Against, the Yibir sample sizes are small, as they usually are for minority population genetics. There is a real risk of reference panel bias, because if the Levantine reference in the database is disproportionately Jewish, everything nearby gets pulled in a Jewish direction. And no ancient DNA has yet been extracted from an Iron Age Somali or Yibir burial to anchor the date directly. The clock is a molecular estimate, not a sequenced grave. That is why the honest limits matter, and they need to be stated plainly. What the evidence does show is a real, non-random Levantine paternal founder signal inside the Yibir, dated to the Iron Age, converging with their oral tradition, corroborated by archaeology and by disease genetics. What the evidence does not prove is that the founders were Jewish in a strictly religious sense. Iron Age Israelites, Judahites, Samaritans, and the broader northwest Semitic populations of the Levant shared much of this DNA. Levantine Semitic is what the DNA sees. Jewish is what history interprets on top of that. The evidence also does not prove continuous religious practice. The Yibir today are Muslim. Whatever ritual identity crossed the Red Sea 2,000 years ago did not survive Islamization intact. Sample sizes remain small. Replication in an independent Yibir cohort is needed. Ancient DNA from either coast is still missing. This is a strong signal. It is not a closed case. Now bring it back to you. Look in the mirror. If your family tree touches the Horn of Africa, the Red Sea coast, Yemen, or any of the old East African trading cities, some piece of this story may sit in your own chromosomes. A low percentage Levantine founder segment your grandparents never mentioned because they never knew it was there. A 1% slice on a printout that has been quietly waiting for someone to notice. Many of you have already taken a consumer DNA test, 23andMe, MyHeritage, Ancestry DNA. If your reports have flagged a small Middle Eastern or Levantine segment while the rest of your ancestry is Somali, Ethiopian, Eritrean, Yemeni, or coastal East African, those companies typically label it as trace noise and move on. Sometimes it is noise. Sometimes it is a 2,000-year-old fingerprint. Not a myth, not a coincidence, not noise. Which brings us back to the line at the start of the video. The one number that made the lead geneticist rerun the sequencer 3 times. That number came from the identity by descent comparison. When the team measured segment sharing between the Yibir and the Yemenite Jewish reference panel, the score came back higher than the score the Yemenite Jewish reference panel produced with itself when they split it into geographic subgroups. 2 populations, separated by the Red Sea and 2 millennia, matched each other more tightly than one population matched its own internal branches. That is what stopped him. That is why he ran it again, and it kept holding. The surprising DNA mystery behind Somali Jews isn't that they exist, it's that they were always there, and their genome remembered when their language forgot. If you have ever opened a consumer DNA report and seen a small, unexplained Middle Eastern or Levantine percentage, and your family is East African, Somali, Ethiopian, Eritrean, Yemeni, or Red Sea coastal, tell me the country and the exact percentage in the comments. Let's see how far across the Horn this thing really spread.